Hi, I'm Elena, a Purple Heart recipient standing in a church doorway in my dress blues, while my sister's new in-laws pointed and whispered about the lonely soldier girl who couldn't even bring a date. They had no idea I'd just returned from 3 tours overseas, that the reason I came alone wasn't because I was unwanted, but because half my unit didn't make it home. When the groom saw me, everything changed. He dropped to one knee right there at the altar, and suddenly those same people who'd been snickering were scrambling to understand why a man was bowing to the woman they'd just humiliated. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Now tell me, have you ever walked into a room where everyone assumed they knew your story, only to watch their faces change when they learn the truth? Before we dive deep, where are you watching from? And what would you have done if your family's in-laws treated you like you didn't belong at your own sister's wedding? Drop it in the comments because I read every single word, and your stories matter to me. The morning light streamed through the tall windows of St. Catherine's Cathedral in downtown Portland, casting long golden shadows across the marble floor where I'd been standing for the past 10 minutes, just trying to work up the courage to walk inside. My reflection stared back at me from the polished brass door handles. Dress blue uniform pressed to perfection, ribbons aligned with military precision, purple heart pinned exactly where regulation required it to be. My dark hair was pulled, back in the standard military bun, not a strand out of place, but my hands were shaking slightly as I adjusted my white gloves for the 3rd time. This was supposed to be Cassandra's day. My little sister, the one who used to braid friendship bracelets for me before my first deployment, the one who wrote me letters every week when I was stationed in Afghanistan, the one who cried harder than I did when I got wounded and had to come home early from my 3rd tour. She was marrying Marcus Chen, a software engineer she'd met at a coffee shop 2 years ago, and from everything she'd told me over our video calls, he seemed like a genuinely good guy who made her laugh and supported her dreams of opening her own bakery. But this wasn't just about Cassandra and Marcus. This was about his family, the Chens, who had made it abundantly clear over the past 6 months that they had very specific ideas about what kind of people belonged in their social circle. During the engagement party last spring, I'd heard Marcus's mother, Victoria Chen, explaining to her bridge club friends that her son was marrying such a sweet girl from a nice middle-class family. But then she'd lowered her voice to add, though, her sister is one of those military types, you know how they can be. I'd been overseas during most of the wedding planning, finishing up my final deployment with the 82nd Airborne Division. The timing worked out perfectly, or so I thought. I'd be home just in time for the ceremony, just in time to see my baby. Sister walked down the aisle. What I hadn't anticipated was how different everything would feel when I got back. The nightmares were worse than before. The crowds felt overwhelming, and simple social situations that used to be second nature now felt like navigating a minefield. Cassandra had insisted I be her maid of honor, but when Victoria Chen learned about the military connection, she'd somehow convinced Cassandra that it might be more appropriate if her college roommate Emma took on that role instead. "Elena's been through so much," Victoria had said with that fake sympathetic tone that made my skin crawl. "We shouldn't burden her with all those responsibilities when she's still adjusting to being back home." The truth was, I wasn't adjusting. Well, 3 tours in combat zones had left me with more than just the shrapnel scar on my left shoulder that earned me the Purple Heart. I had PTSD that made loud noises send me diving for cover, survivor's guilt that kept me awake most nights, and a growing sense that I didn't quite fit anywhere in the civilian world I'd come home to defend. The Army had been my family for 8 years. My unit had been my brothers and sisters, and now half of them were gone, and the other half were scattered across different bases around the world. So when it came time to RSVP for the wedding, I'd checked the box for attending alone. Not because I couldn't find a date, not because I was antisocial, but because the idea of trying to explain my situation to some civilian guy while also navigating a formal family event felt like more than I could handle. I'd rather show up solo and focus on celebrating Cassandra than spend the whole night managing someone else's discomfort with my military experience. The invitation had been addressed to Elena Rodriguez and guest, printed on thick cream cardstock. With elegant script lettering. Cassandra had texted me separately to ask if I was bringing anyone, and when I told her I'd be coming alone, she'd simply replied with a heart emoji and, "Can't wait to see you, sis." But I knew Victoria Chen had been asking questions. Cassandra had mentioned during one of our calls that Marcus's mother kept wondering why I couldn't find a nice young man to bring as my date. Standing outside the cathedral now, I could hear the gentle murmur of conversation and the soft notes of the string quartet inside. The wedding was set to begin in 20 minutes, and I knew I needed to find my seat, but something was holding me back. Maybe it was the way Victoria had looked at me during the rehearsal dinner last night, like I was some kind of charity case that her son's fiancé had dragged along. Maybe it was overhearing Marcus's Uncle James making jokes about G.I. Jane and wondering aloud why women these days thought they needed to play soldier. The heavy wooden doors swung open, and I stepped inside, my heels clicking against the marble floor with each measured step. The cathedral was beautiful, decorated with white roses and baby's breath, exactly the kind of elegant simplicity that Cassandra had always loved. Sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows, painting rainbow patterns across the pews that were filled with family and friends dressed in their finest formal wear. But as I walked down the center aisle looking for my assigned seat, I became acutely aware of the conversations that stopped mid-sentence, the heads that turned to follow my progress, the whispered comments that weren't quite quiet enough to escape my notice. Victoria Chen sat in the front row on the groom's side, wearing a navy blue dress and the expression of barely concealed disapproval. She leaned over to whisper something to the woman next to her, and both of them looked in my direction with what could only be described as pity. "Poor thing," I heard someone say behind me. "Couldn't even find anyone to come with her." "I heard she's been having a hard time since she got back," another voice added. "You know how these military women can be. So intense, so masculine. It's probably difficult for her to relate to normal men." My face burned with embarrassment, but I kept walking, spine straight, chin up, just like they'd taught me in basic training. I found my seat 3 rows from the front on the bride's side, next to my Aunt Carmen, who squeezed my hand sympathetically as I sat down. The conversations around me gradually resumed their normal volume, but I could still feel eyes on me, still hear the occasional comment about how sad it was that I had to come alone to my own sister's wedding. What they didn't know, what none of them could possibly understand, was that I hadn't come alone by choice in the way they assumed. I'd come alone because the person I would have brought, my best friend and battle buddy Sergeant Maria Santos, was buried in Arlington National Cemetery with a folded flag and a letter from the president thanking her family for her sacrifice. I'd come alone because the last civilian relationship I'd tried to maintain had ended when my boyfriend told me I'd changed too much, and he couldn't handle dating someone who'd killed people. I'd come alone because sometimes the weight of carrying other people's expectations felt heavier than the 50-pound pack I'd carried through the mountains of Afghanistan. The organ music began to play, signaling that the ceremony was about to start, and I watched as Marcus took his place at the altar next to the officiant. He looked nervous but happy, adjusting his tie and scanning the crowd with a smile. His groomsmen flanked him, all clean-cut professional types in matching gray suits, and for a moment I felt a pang of sadness that Cassandra and I had grown so far apart that I didn't even know most of the important people in her life anymore. But then Marcus's eyes found mine across the crowded cathedral, and something unexpected happened. His expression changed, not to the polite acknowledgement I was expecting, but to something deeper, more intense. He stared at me for a long moment, his gaze dropping to the ribbons on my uniform, lingering on the Purple Heart, then returning to my face with an expression I couldn't quite read. The back doors of the cathedral opened again, and the wedding party began their processional down the aisle. Emma, the maid of honor who'd taken my place, walked with careful steps in her pale pink dress, followed by two other bridesmaids I didn't recognize. Behind them came Cassandra, radiant in white lace, her arm linked through our father's as he walked her toward her new life. But even as I watched my sister's beautiful moment, I couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had just passed between Marcus and me. Something that had nothing to do with the wedding ceremony, and everything to do with a recognition that ran deeper than family connections or social expectations. The reception hall at the Riverside Country Club buzzed with the kind of refined energy that came from people who were used to nice things and wanted everyone to know it. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over round tables dressed in ivory linens, each centerpiece a carefully arranged bouquet of white peonies and eucalyptus that probably cost more than I'd spent on groceries in the past month. The venue overlooked the Willamette River, and through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see the water reflecting the early evening light like scattered diamonds. I'd been assigned to table 7, strategically positioned far enough from the head table to make it clear I wasn't part of the inner circle, but close enough that I couldn't be accused of being completely excluded. My table mates were a mix of Cassandra's college friends and some distant relatives from our mother's side of the family, people who smiled politely when I introduced myself, but didn't quite know what to do with a woman in military dress uniform, at what was clearly meant to be an elegant civilian affair. "So, Elena," said Jennifer, one of Cassandra's sorority sisters, her voice carrying that particular tone people used when they were trying to fill awkward silence. "Cassandra mentioned you're in the army. That must be interesting." She said the word interesting the way someone might describe a documentary about sewage treatment plants, technically acknowledging its existence while making it clear they had no desire to learn more about it. Before I could answer, the woman next to her, whose name tag read Melissa Kappa Delta 2018, leaned forward with the kind of aggressive curiosity that made my shoulders tense. "Have you ever actually, been in combat? Like, have you had to shoot anyone?" She asked this with the same casual tone she might use to inquire about my favorite Netflix series, as if taking another person's life was just another conversation. Starter at a wedding reception. I took a sip of my water, buying myself time to formulate a response that wouldn't make everyone at the table uncomfortable while also not opening myself up to the kind of follow-up questions that always came next. "I served 3 tours overseas," I said carefully. "My job was to protect my fellow soldiers and complete our mission. That's what I focused on." The truth was more complicated, of course. The truth was that I'd been a combat medic with the 82nd Airborne, which meant I'd seen things that still visited me in my dreams every night. I'd patched up 19-year-old kids who'd stepped on IEDs, held the hands of soldiers who were dying thousands of miles from home, and yes, I'd fired my weapon when our convoy was ambushed outside Kandahar. But those weren't stories for a wedding reception. And they certainly weren't stories for people who were asking out of morbid curiosity rather than genuine respect. Melissa nodded like she understood, but her eyes had already glazed over with the particular kind of discomfort that civilians got when they realized military service involved actual consequences. The conversation shifted to safer topics: Jennifer's new job at a marketing firm, someone's recent engagement, complaints about the price of gas, and I found myself listening with the detached attention I'd perfected over years of mandatory social events. Across the room, I could see the Chen family table, a cluster of well-dressed professionals who looked like they'd stepped out of a country club brochure. Victoria Chen held court at the center, her perfectly styled silver hair catching the light as she gestured animatedly while telling what appeared to be a very entertaining story. Her husband, Robert, nodded along with the practiced ease of someone who'd been married for 30 years and had learned when to laugh at the appropriate moments. Marcus's younger brother, David, sat to Victoria's left, still in his groomsman tuxedo, but with his bow tie loosened and his sleeves rolled up. He was about my age, maybe a year or two younger, with the kind of confident posture that came from never having to worry about whether he belonged somewhere. Next to him sat his girlfriend, a petite blonde woman in a black cocktail dress who kept taking photos of everything with her phone, probably for Instagram or whatever social media platform was popular with people who considered expensive wine and artisanal cheese to be personality traits. Watched as Victoria's gaze swept across the reception hall, taking inventory of the guests like a general surveying her troops. When her eyes landed on me, her expression tightened almost imperceptibly. She said something to the woman next to her, and both of them looked in my direction with the kind of subtle disdain that rich people had perfected, never obvious enough to be called out, but clear enough to make sure you knew where you stood in their hierarchy. The woman Victoria had been speaking to was her sister Janet, who I'd met briefly during the cocktail hour. Janet had introduced herself with a firm handshake and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, then immediately asked what I did in the real world when I wasn't playing soldier. When I'd explained that the army was my career, not a hobby, she'd laughed like I'd made a joke and said something about how nice it was that the military gave young people structure, until they figured out what they really wanted to do with their lives. Now Janet was whispering something to Victoria while gesturing subtly in my direction, and I didn't need to be a lip reader to know they weren't discussing my impressive posture or the precision of my uniform ribbons. Victoria nodded along, her expression growing more disapproving with each word, and I felt the familiar tightness in my chest that came with being talked about like I wasn't in the room. The band began playing something slow and romantic, and couples started making their way to the dance floor. Cassandra and Marcus swayed together in the center, looking completely absorbed in each other, and for a moment I felt a genuine surge of happiness for my little sister. She deserved this, the beautiful dress, the elegant venue, the man who looked at her like she was the most important person in the world. She deserved to have her perfect day without any complications or drama. But then I noticed David Chen approaching my table, his expression carrying the kind of calculated friendliness that immediately put me on guard. He'd clearly been sent on a mission by his mother, probably to check on the lone military woman who was sitting by herself and potentially bringing down the sophisticated atmosphere of their family celebration. "Elena, right?" he said, extending his hand with a smile that was probably meant to be charming but came across as condescending. "I'm David, Marcus's brother. Mind if I sit for a minute?" I gestured to the empty chair next to me, wondering what kind of conversation I was about to be subjected to. David settled himself with the casual confidence of someone who'd never had to worry about whether his presence was welcome somewhere. "So, my mom mentioned you're military," he said, as if this were some exotic hobby rather than my profession. "That's really cool. I've always had a lot of respect for people who serve." He paused, clearly expecting some kind of grateful response to his magnanimous approval of my life choices. When I didn't immediately thank him for his respect, he continued, "I actually thought about joining after college, but I ended up going straight to law school instead. Different kind of service, you know? Fighting for justice in the courtroom instead of on the battlefield." He delivered this comparison with the kind of self-satisfied tone that suggested he genuinely believed corporate litigation was equivalent to combat service. "That's nice," I said, taking another sip of my water and hoping he'd take the hint that I wasn't interested in a lengthy conversation about his career choices. But David was clearly just getting started. "You know, I have to ask, and I hope this doesn't sound rude, but why didn't you bring a date tonight? I mean, you seem like a nice woman, and I'm sure there are plenty of guys who would have been honored to escort someone who served our country." The question hit me like a physical blow, not because it was unexpected, but because of the casual way he asked it, like my personal life was somehow his business to discuss. I could feel the attention of my table mates shifting back to our conversation, their curiosity piqued by the prospect of finally learning why the sad military woman had come to the wedding alone. "I preferred to come alone," I said, keeping my voice level despite the anger building in my chest. "I wanted to focus on celebrating Cassandra and Marcus." David nodded like this made perfect sense, but his expression suggested he wasn't buying it. Sure, I get that. But I mean, there had to be someone you could have asked. A fellow soldier, maybe? Or someone from your hometown? He was probing now, trying to get me to admit to some personal failing or romantic disappointment. That would explain my single status in terms his family could understand and pity. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I'd been engaged once to a Marine named Jake Rodriguez, who I'd met during my second deployment. We'd planned to get married when we both finished our tours, had talked about settling down near Fort Campbell where we could both continue our military careers while building a life together. But Jake had been killed by a roadside bomb 3 months before he was supposed to come home. And I'd spent the past 2 years trying to figure out how to move forward when the future I'd planned had been erased in an instant. What David Chen couldn't possibly understand was that coming to this wedding alone wasn't a sign of failure or social inadequacy. It was an act of strength. A decision to show up for my sister, despite the fact that being around happy couples still made my chest feel hollow and reminded me of everything I'd lost. But I wasn't about to explain any of that to a privileged law student who thought military service was just another line on a resume, so I simply smiled and said, "Sometimes alone is better." The dinner service began with the kind of choreographed precision that only came from paying premium prices for premium service. Servers in crisp, white uniforms glided between tables, setting down plates of herb-crusted salmon and filet mignon with practiced efficiency. The conversation at my table had mercifully shifted away from my personal life and toward safer topics like the quality of the food and speculation about where Cassandra and Marcus would honeymoon. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every few minutes I'd catch someone from the Chen family table glancing in my direction, their conversations pausing just long enough to make it clear I was the subject under discussion. Victoria Chen seemed particularly interested in monitoring my behavior, as if she expected me to suddenly stand on my chair and start shouting military cadences or something equally inappropriate for the refined atmosphere she'd helped create. The feeling intensified when I excused myself to use the restroom during the salad course. The ladies' lounge was decorated in the same elegant style as the reception hall, with marble countertops, gold-framed mirrors, and a sitting area with plush velvet chairs that probably cost more than my monthly housing allowance. I was washing my hands when Victoria Chen herself walked in, flanked by 2 other women I recognized as Marcus's aunts from the ceremony. "Oh, Elena," Victoria said with that particular tone of voice that always preceded something unpleasant. "I was hoping I'd have a chance to speak with you privately." I dried my hand slowly, using the time to prepare myself for whatever was coming. In my peripheral vision, I could see the 2 aunts positioning themselves near the door, not quite blocking my exit, but making it clear this wasn't going to be a brief, casual conversation. "I want you to know how much we appreciate you being here for Cassandra," Victoria continued, her words dripping with the kind of false sincerity that made my skin crawl. "Family is so important, especially during these milestone moments." I nodded, politely, waiting for the real purpose of this cornering to reveal itself. Victoria was the type of woman who never said anything directly when she could wrap it in layers of passive-aggressive politeness instead. "I hope you don't mind me asking," she said, moving closer to the mirror and pretending to check her lipstick. "But I'm curious about your plans now that you're back from your deployment." She said the word like it was something slightly distasteful, an unpleasant necessity that polite people didn't discuss in detail. "I'm transitioning to civilian life," I said carefully, "taking some time to figure out my next steps." Victoria's reflection in the mirror showed a flash of something that might have been satisfaction. "Of course, that must be so difficult. I can't imagine how challenging it must be to adjust to normal society after spending so much time in such a violent environment." One of the aunts, a thin woman with silver hair and sharp features, stepped forward with what she probably thought was a helpful suggestion. "Have you considered counseling? I know there are programs specifically designed for people with your background." PTSD is nothing to be ashamed of, dear. The casual way she threw around the PTSD diagnosis, like it was something she could determine, just by looking at me, made my jaw clench. These women knew nothing about my mental health, nothing about what I'd experienced overseas, nothing about the months of therapy and medical evaluations I'd already completed as part of my transition process. But they felt comfortable making assumptions based on whatever stereotypes they'd absorbed from movies and television shows. I appreciate your concern, I said, forcing my voice to remain level, but I'm doing fine. Victoria turned away from the mirror to face me directly, and I could see she was building up to her real point. I hope you understand that today is about Cassandra and Marcus starting their new life together. It's important that nothing disrupt that happiness. The implication was clear. My presence, my military background, my failure to conform to their expectations of appropriate wedding guest behavior was somehow threatening to ruin my sister's special day. They wanted me to know that I was being watched, monitored, judged, and that any deviation from their narrow definition of acceptable behavior would be noted and used against me. I would never do anything to hurt Cassandra, I said, my voice harder now despite my efforts to stay diplomatic. She's my sister and I love her. Of course you do, Victoria said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. But sometimes love means knowing when to step back, when to let others take the lead who might be better equipped to handle delicate social situations. The second aunt, who had been silent until now, decided to add her contribution to this character assassination disguised as concern. We just worry that all that military training might make it difficult for you to relate to civilian gatherings. The intensity, the hypervigilance, it's understandable, but it can make other people uncomfortable. I stared at her, momentarily, speechless at the audacity of these women who had never spent a day in uniform, never put their lives on the line for anything more dangerous than a charity auction, presuming to lecture me about how my service had somehow made me unfit for polite society. I think there's been a misunderstanding, I said, straightening to my full height and letting some of the steel I'd learned in the army creep into my voice. I'm here to celebrate my sister's wedding, not to cause problems. But I'm also not going to apologize for my service or pretend to be someone I'm not to make you more comfortable. Victoria's mask of polite concern slipped slightly, revealing a flash of the calculation underneath. Of course not, dear. We're just hoping that everyone can have a lovely evening without any incidents. The word incidents hung in the air, like a threat. They were setting me up, I realized, with a clarity that cut through my anger like a knife. They were documenting my responses, building a narrative about the unstable veteran who couldn't handle social situations, creating justification for whatever they were planning to do next. I was saved from having to respond by the arrival of 2 more women entering the restroom, their cheerful chatter breaking the tension that had been building in the small space. Victoria immediately shifted back into hostess mode, greeting the newcomers with warm smiles and compliments about their dresses. I used the interruption to make my escape, walking back to the reception hall with my mind racing. The conversation in the bathroom hadn't been random. It had been planned, orchestrated, designed to either provoke me into an outburst they could point to later or to intimidate me into leaving early. Either outcome would serve their purpose of removing the inconvenient military woman who didn't fit their vision of appropriate wedding guests. Back at my table, I noticed that my place setting looked different. My water glass had been refilled, which was normal, but my dinner plate had been moved slightly, and there was a small water ring on the tablecloth where it hadn't been before. Someone had been at my seat while I was gone, and the realization made my combat instincts kick into high gear. Jennifer, the sorority sister who'd been asking about my military service earlier, looked up as I sat down with an expression of barely contained excitement. "Oh, Elena, you missed the most interesting conversation while you were gone. David Chen was just telling us about his brother's military connections." My fork paused halfway to my mouth. Military connections? Apparently, Marcus served too. Melissa chimed in, her voice carrying the kind of gossipy enthusiasm that suggested this was news to everyone at the table. David said he never talks about it, but he was in Afghanistan around the same time you were. Isn't that such a coincidence? The piece of salmon in my mouth suddenly tasted like cardboard. Marcus had been in Afghanistan. Marcus, my sister's new husband, who I'd barely had a real conversation with during the entire engagement period, had served in the same theater where I'd spent 3 tours of my life, and somehow, in all the months of wedding planning and family dinners and casual conversations, this had never come up. I looked across the room toward the head table, where Marcus was laughing at something Cassandra had whispered in his ear. He looked so different from the soldiers I'd served with, clean-shaven, soft around the edges, comfortable in his expensive tuxedo in a way that suggested he'd never had to sleep in full gear or eat MREs for weeks at a time. But then I remembered the moment during the ceremony when our eyes had met. The way his expression had changed when he'd seen my uniform, the recognition that had passed between us that I hadn't been able to identify at the time. Maybe it hadn't been recognition at all. Maybe it had been something else entirely. Did David mention what Marcus did in Afghanistan? I asked, trying to keep my voice casual, despite the sudden urgency I felt to understand this new piece of information. Jennifer shrugged. Something about logistics, I think. He said Marcus was based at some big compound, coordinating supply runs or something like that. Very hush-hush, apparently. Logistics, supply runs. The words triggered a memory that made my blood run cold. A memory of a convoy ambush outside Kandahar where everything had gone wrong, where good soldiers had died because someone in logistics had sent them down the wrong route at the wrong time with inadequate security. I'd been part of the medical team that had responded to that mess, had spent hours trying to patch up kids who'd been torn apart by an IED that intelligence said shouldn't have been there. I forced myself to take another bite of salmon, to nod, along with the conversation that had moved on to other topics, but my mind was spinning with possibilities that I didn't want to consider. The timing was wrong, the details didn't match, and I was probably letting my paranoia get the better of me. But something about this revelation felt significant in a way I couldn't quite articulate, like finding a puzzle piece that didn't belong to the picture I thought I was assembling. The servers began clearing the dinner plates, and the band announced that it was time for the traditional dances. I watched as Cassandra and Marcus took the floor for their first dance as husband and wife, moving together with the kind of easy grace that came from hours of lessons and genuine affection for each other. But now, instead of seeing a happy couple, celebrating their love, I found myself studying Marcus with new eyes, looking for signs of the soldier he'd apparently once been, wondering what other secrets were hiding beneath the surface of this picture-perfect wedding. The band transitioned from the romantic first dance to something more upbeat, and the dance floor began filling with couples and groups of friends. I remained at my table, nursing a glass of wine and watching the celebration unfold, while my mind continued to process the revelation about Marcus's military service. The coincidence felt too significant to ignore, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there were layers to this story I wasn't seeing yet. Emma, the maid of honor who'd taken my original role, approached my table with a bright smile and slightly flushed cheeks that suggested she'd been enjoying the open bar. "Elena, there you are. Cassandra has been looking for you. She wants to get some photos with just family before the night gets too crazy." I followed Emma toward the corner of the reception hall, where a professional photographer had set up with portable lighting equipment. Cassandra stood in the center of a small group, her wedding dress spread around her like a cloud of silk and lace, directing family members into various poses with the confidence of someone who'd been planning this moment for months. "Elena," she called out when she saw me approaching. "Perfect timing. I want to get some shots with just us girls before Dad insists on doing the big extended family thing." But as I moved to join the group, I noticed Victoria Chen approaching. From the opposite direction, her expression carrying the kind of determined politeness that always preceded an uncomfortable conversation. She intercepted me just before I reached the photographer's setup, placing a manicured hand on my arm with enough pressure to make it clear this wasn't a casual greeting. "Elena, dear, before you join the photos, I was wondering if we could have just a quick word." Her smile was perfect, but her eyes held a hardness that made my stomach tighten with anticipation. Cassandra looked up from adjusting her veil, clearly confused by the interruption. "Victoria, is everything okay? The photographer is on a tight schedule." "Of course, sweetheart. This will just take a moment." Victoria's grip on my arm tightened slightly as she guided me away from the photo area toward a quieter corner near the windows overlooking the river. Once we were out of earshot of the wedding party, Victoria's mask of politeness dropped entirely. Her voice remained low and controlled, but there was an edge to it that hadn't been there during our bathroom confrontation. "I think there's been enough disruption for one evening," she said, her words precise and cutting. "Your behavior tonight has been concerning, making our other guests uncomfortable with your intensity, monopolizing conversations about military service, and frankly, your presence in that uniform is creating exactly the kind of atmosphere we were hoping to avoid." I stared at her, genuinely confused by the accusations. I haven't done any of those things. I've barely spoken to anyone beyond basic pleasantries. "That's not how others have perceived it," Victoria continued, pulling out her phone and scrolling through what appeared to be a series of text messages. "I've received several comments from our family friends about feeling intimidated by your demeanor. The rigid posture, the way you scan the room like you're looking for threats, the way you interrogated David about Marcus's background. The last accusation hit me like a physical blow. I hadn't interrogated anyone about anything. I'd simply asked follow-up questions when David had mentioned his brother's military service, which seemed like normal conversation to me. But apparently, my natural curiosity had been interpreted as aggressive investigation. I was making conversation, I said, working to keep my voice level despite the anger building in my chest. Someone mentioned Marcus had served and I was interested because we might have overlapping experiences. Victoria's expression hardened further. That's exactly what I'm talking about. This obsession with military connections. This need to make everything about your service. It's inappropriate for a celebration like this. From across the room, I could see Cassandra glancing in our direction with growing concern. The photographer was checking his watch impatiently, and the other family members were starting to look uncomfortable as they waited for the photo session to continue. "I think you should consider leaving early," Victoria said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Before this situation becomes more embarrassing for everyone involved. Cassandra would understand. You're clearly not in the right headspace for a social event like this." The suggestion felt like a slap across the face. Victoria Chen was trying to get me to voluntarily remove myself from my own sister's wedding, using my military service and my PTSD as weapons against me. She was painting my presence as disruptive and my behavior as inappropriate, creating a narrative that would justify my absence and make it look like I'd chosen to leave rather than being forced out. "No," I said, the word coming out harder than I'd intended. "I'm not leaving. This is my sister's wedding, and I have every right to be here." Victoria's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, her carefully controlled facade cracked entirely. "Your rights end where other people's comfort begins. This is a private family celebration, not a veterans reunion. If you can't behave appropriately, then perhaps, what's going on over here?" The voice that interrupted Victoria's threat was male, authoritative, and carried an undertone that made both of us turn. Marcus had approached from the direction of the head table, his expression serious as he looked between Victoria and me. "Nothing that concerns you, dear," Victoria said, immediately shifting back into her sweet mother-in-law voice. "Elena and I were just having a little chat about the evening's festivities." But Marcus wasn't buying it, his gaze fixed on me with an intensity that reminded me suddenly of the moment during the ceremony when our eyes had met across the cathedral. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez," he said, and the formal address made my breath catch in my throat. Victoria looked confused by the military title, but I understood immediately what Marcus was doing. He wasn't just acknowledging my rank, he was claiming knowledge of it, demonstrating that he knew more about my service record than casual conversation would have revealed. "Sir," I replied automatically, falling back on military protocol because I didn't know what else to do in this suddenly charged moment. Marcus nodded once, a sharp gesture that belonged more in a briefing room than at a wedding. "Reception? I think there might be some confusion here. Would you mind if we spoke privately? There are some things I'd like to clarify." Victoria stepped forward, clearly unwilling to lose control of the situation she'd been orchestrating. "Marcus, sweetheart, I really don't think this is the time or place for mother," Marcus said, and the single word carried enough authority to stop Victoria mid-sentence. "I can handle this." The way he said mother wasn't affectionate or deferential. It was a command wrapped in familial politeness, the kind of tone that made it clear the conversation was over whether Victoria liked it or not. Marcus gestured toward a quieter area near the bar, and I followed him, acutely aware that we were drawing attention from other guests. Conversations paused as we walked past, and I could feel dozens of eyes tracking our movement across the reception hall. When we reached a relatively private corner, Marcus turned to face me directly. Up close, I could see details I'd missed during the ceremony. Faint lines around his eyes that spoke of stress or sleepless nights. A small scar on his left temple that had been hidden by his hair during the formal photos, and something in his posture that I now recognized as distinctly military, despite his civilian clothes. "Kandahar Province, 2019, he said without preamble. "Forward Operating Base Chapman. You were with the 82nd Airborne Medical Corps." My heart stopped. Those weren't details he could have gotten from casual research or family gossip. FOB Chapman was where I'd spent the worst 6 months of my military career, where I'd lost more soldiers than I'd saved, where the nightmares that still woke me up screaming had been born. "How do you know that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Marcus glanced around to make sure we weren't being overheard, then leaned closer. "Because I was there too. Different unit, different mission. But I remember the medic who went outside the wire to extract casualties from that convoy ambush in October. I remember hearing about the staff sergeant who stayed with a wounded soldier for 6 hours while taking enemy fire, who refused to leave him behind even when the evacuation helicopter couldn't land. The memory hit me like a physical blow. Specialist Tommy Morrison, 19 years old from Kansas, who'd stepped on an IED while we were returning from a supply run. The blast had taken his left leg and shattered his pelvis, and he'd been bleeding, out in a dried creek bed while insurgents fired at us from the surrounding hills. I'd used my own body to shield him while calling in air support, talking to him about his girlfriend back home and his plans to study engineering after his deployment. Anything to keep him conscious until the medevac could reach us. Tommy had lived. He'd lost the leg, but he'd lived. And the last I'd heard, he was married to that girlfriend and working as a civil engineer in Topeka. But I'd never talked about that day with anyone outside my unit, had never even mentioned it in my official reports beyond the basic tactical details. "That was you," Marcus said, and it wasn't a question. "You saved his life." I nodded, not trusting, my voice to remain steady. The recognition in Marcus's eyes wasn't the kind of casual respect civilians offered when they learned about military service. It was the specific acknowledgement that only came from shared experience, from understanding exactly what that day had cost and what it had meant. "Tommy Morrison," I managed to say. "How do you know about Tommy?" Marcus's expression grew complicated, a mixture of respect and something else I couldn't identify. "Because I was the logistics officer who sent that convoy down the wrong route." The words hit me like a physical blow, and I had to grip the edge of the bar to keep myself steady. Marcus Chen, my sister's new husband, the man who'd just called me by my military rank with obvious respect, was admitting to being responsible for the worst day of my third deployment. The convoy ambush that had nearly killed Tommy Morrison, and 3 other soldiers, the mission that had gone sideways because someone in logistics had sent us down a route that intelligence had flagged as compromised. "I need to sit down," I said, my voice sounding hollow and distant even to my own ears. Marcus immediately guided me to 2 empty chairs near the windows, his hand on my elbow with the kind of steady support that came from experience managing people in crisis. The gesture was so familiar, so reminiscent of the way we'd helped wounded soldiers in the field, that it made my chest tight with conflicting emotions. "Elena, I need you to understand something," Marcus said once we were seated, his voice low and urgent. "That convoy route wasn't my decision. I was a lieutenant then, barely 6 months into my deployment, and I was given intelligence that turned out to be wrong. The route was supposed to be clear, secured by a patrol that had gone through 2 hours earlier." I stared at him, trying to process this information while my mind replayed every detail of that October morning. The convoy had been routine, a supply run to deliver medical supplies and ammunition to a smaller outpost about 20 kilometers from Fob Chapman. We'd done the same route dozens of times before, but that morning something had felt different. The local civilians who usually waved at our vehicles had been conspicuously absent, and the radio chatter from the advanced scouts had carried an edge of tension that made my medic instincts kick into high gear. "The intelligence was compromised," Marcus continued, his hands clenched into fists on his knees. "We didn't find out until after the attack that one of our local interpreters had been feeding information to insurgent groups. He'd told them exactly when and where the convoy would be traveling, and they'd had time to set up a complex ambush with multiple IEDs. The revelation should have made me feel better, should have shifted the blame away from the young logistics officer who'd been following orders and toward the system that had failed all of us. But instead, it made me angrier, because it meant that Tommy Morrison's injuries and the deaths of Sergeant Williams and Corporal Davis had been completely preventable if the right people had been paying attention to the right warning signs. 3. Soldiers died, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Tommy lost his leg. Martinez still can't use his right arm properly. And you're telling me it was all because of a compromised interpreter? Marcus nodded, his expression carrying the weight of guilt I recognized from my own mirror. I know. I've carried that with me every day since. I tried to get transferred to a different unit afterward, tried to get reassigned to something that wouldn't put other soldiers at risk, but my commanding officer convinced me to stay, said I'd learned a valuable lesson about verifying intelligence sources. I wanted to be angry with him. I wanted to blame him for the sleepless nights, the nightmares, the way that October morning had changed everything about how I approached my job and my life. But looking at him now, seeing the genuine remorse in his eyes and the way he carried himself like a man who'd been living with the weight of that day for years, I realized that Marcus had been as much a victim of the system's failures as the rest of us. Why didn't you tell Cassandra? I asked. Why keep your military service a secret? Marcus ran a hand through his hair, disturbing the careful styling that had been perfect for the wedding photos. Because I was ashamed. Because I didn't want to be defined by the worst decision I ever made, even if it wasn't really my decision to make. I got out as soon as my commitment was up, went to college, tried to build a completely different life. From across the reception hall, I could see Cassandra still waiting by the photographer's setup, her expression growing more concerned as she watched Marcus and me in what clearly looked like an intense conversation. The other family members were shifting restlessly, and I knew we were creating exactly the kind of scene that Victoria Chen had been trying to avoid. She's going to want to know what this is about, I said, nodding toward my sister. I know, Marcus replied. I've been planning to tell her about my service record anyway. We're married now, and she deserves to know everything about my past. I just wasn't sure how to bring it up without making it sound like I was trying to Compete with your experiences or diminish what you went through. The admission revealed something about Marcus that I hadn't expected. A level of emotional intelligence and consideration that suggested he'd thought carefully about how his military background might affect his relationship with Cassandra and, by extension, with me. He'd been protecting not just his own feelings, but ours as well. "Elena, there's something else I need to tell you," Marcus said, his voice dropping even lower. "About why I was really at FOB Chapman, and why I know so much about what happened during that convoy ambush." I braced myself for another revelation, wondering what other secrets were about to surface at my sister's wedding reception. The evening had already taken so many unexpected turns that I felt like I was navigating a minefield without a map. "I wasn't just a logistics officer," Marcus continued. "I was part of a joint intelligence unit that was investigating security breaches in the local contractor network. The compromised interpreter you mentioned, Khalil Nasiri, he was someone we'd been watching for weeks before the convoy attack. The name hit me like a lightning bolt. Khalil Nasiri had been more than just an interpreter. He'd been someone our unit had worked with regularly, someone who'd helped coordinate medical evacuation routes and had access to sensitive information about our movements and capabilities. I'd personally worked with him during several medical missions, had trusted him to help communicate with wounded local civilians. "You knew he was compromised before the convoy?" I asked, my voice rising despite my efforts to keep our conversation private. "We suspected," Marcus said quickly, "but we didn't have concrete proof, and our unit commander decided to use the convoy as a way to test our theory. The idea was that if Khalil was really feeding information to insurgents, they'd try to hit the convoy, and we'd be ready for them." I stared at Marcus in complete shock, my mind struggling to process what he was telling me. The convoy that had nearly killed Tommy Morrison and had killed 3 other soldiers hadn't just been the victim of a security breach. It had been deliberately used as bait in an intelligence operation. "You used us," I said, the words coming out flat and cold. "You used my soldiers, my patients, as bait to catch a double agent." Marcus's face went pale, and he started to reach toward me, then stopped himself. "Elena, it wasn't supposed to go that way. We had air support on standby. We had rapid response teams in position. The intelligence said the insurgents would try to hit the convoy, but we thought we could contain it, control it." "Control it?" I stood up abruptly, my chair scraping against the floor loud enough to draw attention from nearby guests. "You thought you could control an IED ambush? You thought you could manage the situation when soldiers started dying?" Several people at the surrounding tables had turned to look at us, and I could see Victoria Chen moving in our direction with an expression of barely contained fury. But I didn't care about the scene we were creating, or the elegant atmosphere we were disrupting. All I could think about was Tommy Morrison's blood on my hands, and the way Sergeant Williams had looked at me with confusion and fear as he'd died from shrapnel wounds that could have been prevented if someone had just told us the truth about what we were walking into. "The operation was supposed to be surgical," Marcus said desperately, his voice carrying the tone of a man who'd been defending this decision to himself for years. "We were going to let them initiate contact, then use our superior position and firepower to eliminate the threat while gathering intelligence about their network." "Surgical," I repeated, the word tasting like poison in my mouth. 3 dead soldiers and 4 wounded, including one who'll never walk properly again. That's your definition of surgical? Marcus opened his mouth to respond, but before he could say anything, Victoria Chen arrived at our little corner with the force of a tornado in designer clothing. Her carefully maintained composure had cracked entirely, and she looked like a woman who was barely keeping herself from exploding in public. "What is going on here?" she hissed, her voice low but carrying enough venom to make both Marcus and me take a step back. "Half the reception is staring at you two. Cassandra is in tears because she thinks you're fighting, and you're making a spectacle of yourselves at what is supposed to be a celebration." I looked across the room and saw that Victoria was right. Cassandra, was standing near the photographer with tears streaming down her face, still in her beautiful wedding dress but looking completely lost and confused. Emma and the other bridesmaids were clustered around her, trying to offer comfort while shooting worried glances in our direction. The sight of my sister crying on her wedding day because of a conversation between her new husband and me about something that had happened years ago in a war zone felt like the final straw. I'd come to this wedding to celebrate Cassandra's happiness, not to relive the worst day of my military career, or to confront the man who'd been partially responsible for it. "I need some air," I said, pushing past Victoria and heading toward the exit that led to the country club's outdoor terrace. Behind me, I could hear Marcus calling my name, but I didn't stop. I needed space to process what I'd just learned, to figure out how to handle the revelation that my sister had married someone who'd been part of the intelligence operation that had nearly gotten me killed. The terrace overlooked the Willamette River, and the cool evening air hit my face like a blessing after the stifling atmosphere inside the reception hall. String lights had been hung between the pergola posts, creating a soft glow that reflected off the water below. Under different circumstances, it would have been beautiful, romantic even. But right now, all I could think about was getting enough oxygen into my lungs to stop the panic attack that was building in my chest. I gripped the stone railing and focused on my breathing, using the techniques my therapist had taught me for managing PTSD episodes. 4 counts in, hold for 4, 4 counts out. The rhythm was supposed to calm my nervous system, but my mind kept racing back to that October morning in Afghanistan, to the sound of the IED explosion, to Tommy Morrison's screams, to the weight of Sergeant Williams as he died in my arms. The door behind me opened, and I tensed, expecting Marcus or Victoria, or maybe even Cassandra to come after me with more explanations or accusations. But the footsteps were lighter, more hesitant, and when I turned around, I saw a woman I didn't recognize approaching cautiously. She looked to be in her 50s, with graying brown hair pulled back in an elegant chignon and wearing a navy blue dress that suggested she was part of the wedding party but not immediate family. Her expression was kind but concerned, and she carried herself with the confidence of someone who was used to handling difficult situations. "I'm sorry to bother you," she said, stopping a few feet away to give me space. "I'm Dr. Sarah Chen, Marcus's aunt. I couldn't help but notice you seemed upset, and I wanted to make sure you were okay." Dr. Chen. The name clicked into place. Marcus had mentioned her during the rehearsal dinner as the family member who'd inspired his interest in public service. She was a psychiatrist who worked with veterans, and suddenly her presence on the terrace felt less like coincidence and more like intervention. "I'm fine," I said automatically, then immediately regretted the lie. Dr. Chen had the kind of eyes that saw through polite deflections, and I could tell she wasn't buying my assertion that everything was under control. "Would you mind if I joined?" "You out here for a few minutes?" she asked. "It's getting pretty stuffy inside, and I could use some fresh air myself." I nodded, not trusting my voice to remain steady if I tried to speak. Dr. Chen moved to stand beside me at the railing, close, enough that I could feel her presence but not so close that I felt crowded or trapped. "I work with a lot of veterans," she said after a moment of comfortable silence. "I've seen that look before, the one you had when you came out here. Something triggered a memory, didn't it?" The question was gentle but direct, and something about her professional manner made me feel like I could trust her with the truth. "Your nephew just told me something about Afghanistan that I wasn't prepared to hear." Dr. Chen nodded slowly. "Marcus mentioned he'd served, but he's never talked about the details. I've always suspected there was more to his story than he was willing to share." "He was involved in an operation that got some of my soldiers killed," I said, the words coming out in a rush before I could stop them. "And he just told me about it in the middle of his wedding reception, like it was something we needed to clear the air about." "That must have been incredibly difficult to hear," Dr. Chen said, her voice carrying the kind of professional empathy that didn't feel patronizing. "Especially in this setting, when you came here to celebrate your sister's happiness." I turned to look at her directly, studying her face for signs of judgment or disapproval. But all I saw was genuine concern and the kind of understanding that came from years of helping people work through trauma. The worst part is, I don't even know how to feel about it, I admitted. Part of me wants to be furious with him, to blame him for everything that went wrong that day. But part of me recognizes that he was just following orders, just trying to do his job in an impossible situation. Dr. Chen leaned against the railing, her posture relaxed and non-threatening. Trauma responses aren't always logical. When we're triggered by something, our brains don't distinguish between past and present, between rational and irrational. The feelings are valid even when the circumstances are complicated. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. From inside the reception hall, I could hear the band playing something upbeat, and the sound of laughter and conversation drifted out through the open doors. The party was continuing without us, and I knew that every minute I stayed out here was another minute that Cassandra spent worrying about what had happened between Marcus and me. I should go back inside, I said, but I didn't move from the railing. This is Cassandra's day, and I'm ruining it by falling apart over something that happened years ago. You're not falling apart, Dr. Chen said firmly. You're processing new information about a traumatic event while trying to maintain your composure at a social gathering. That's actually incredibly resilient behavior. The validation felt like a lifeline, and I found myself blinking back tears I hadn't realized were building. His mother thinks I'm unstable. She's been trying to get me to leave all evening, telling me that I'm making people uncomfortable with my intensity. Dr. Chen's expression hardened slightly, and I caught a glimpse of the steel beneath her professional demeanor. Victoria has very specific ideas about how people should behave, especially at social events. She's not qualified to make assessments about anyone's mental health, and she has no business trying to exclude you from your own sister's wedding. The door opened again, and this time it was Marcus who stepped onto the terrace. He looked haggard, his bow tie loose around his neck and his hair disheveled from running his hands through it. When he saw his aunt with me, he paused uncertainly. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he said. "Elena, I wanted to apologize. I shouldn't have dumped all of that on you tonight, especially not here. My timing was terrible." Dr. Chen looked between Marcus and me, clearly trying to assess the situation and determine whether her continued presence was helpful or intrusive. "I can give you two some privacy if you'd like to talk." "No," I said quickly. "Actually, I think it might be helpful if you stayed. You have experience with this kind of thing, and I'm not sure Marcus and I can navigate this conversation without making things worse." Marcus nodded gratefully. "That's probably a good idea. I've been carrying this guilt for so long that I don't even know how to talk about it properly." Dr. Chen settled back against the railing, her posture indicating that she was prepared to facilitate whatever difficult conversation was about to unfold. "Marcus, why don't you start by explaining what you were hoping to accomplish by telling Elena about your shared history?" Marcus took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts before speaking. I recognized her during the ceremony. Not her face, but her bearing, her uniform, the way she carried herself. I'd heard stories about the medic who'd saved Tommy Morrison, and something about Elena just clicked. I spent the whole reception trying to work up the courage to approach her, to thank her for what she'd done that day. "Thank me?" I asked, genuinely confused by this perspective. "You saved lives," Marcus said earnestly. "Not just Tommy's, but Martinez and Johnson, too. You stayed calm under fire, made life or death decisions while taking enemy fire, refused to abandon wounded soldiers even when it would have been safer to retreat. What you did that day was heroic." I shook my head, rejecting his characterization of my actions. "I was doing my job. Any medic would have done the same thing." "No," Marcus said firmly. "I've seen how different people respond under pressure, and what you did was extraordinary. I've wanted to tell you that for years, but I never had the chance." When I saw you tonight, I thought maybe this was finally my opportunity to set the record straight. Dr. Chen intervened gently. Marcus, I think Elena might be having trouble separating your gratitude from your role in creating the situation that required her heroism in the first place. The observation was exactly right, and I felt some of the tension in my shoulders ease as someone finally articulated what I'd been struggling to express. It's hard to accept thanks from someone who was part of the reason I needed to be heroic, I said. Marcus winced, and I could see that the words had hit their mark. You're right. I was so focused on my own guilt and my desire to make amends that I didn't consider how it would feel from your perspective. I should have approached this completely differently. How should you have approached it? Dr. Chen asked, her tone suggesting this was a genuine question rather than a rhetorical challenge. Marcus considered this for a moment. I should have waited until after the wedding. I should have reached out through proper channels, maybe through a veterans organization or something. I should have given Elena the choice about whether to engage with this conversation instead of ambushing her at her sister's wedding. The acknowledgement felt like progress, and I found myself able to look at Marcus directly for the first time since our conversation had begun. Why didn't you tell Cassandra about your service before now? Because I was afraid she'd ask questions I wasn't ready to answer, Marcus admitted. Questions about what I'd done, what I'd seen, what I'd been responsible for. I thought it would be easier to just leave that part of my life in the past. Dr. Chen made a small sound that might have been disapproval. Marcus, you know that's not how trauma works. The past doesn't stay in the past just because we want it to. I know that now, Marcus said. Seeing Elena tonight, realizing that my decisions had affected her personally, it made me understand that I can't keep running from what happened. I need to deal with it properly, and I need to be honest with Cassandra about who I was before I met her. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of footsteps on the terrace, and all three of us turned to see Cassandra herself approaching, still in her wedding dress but with her makeup slightly smudged from crying. She looked between Marcus and me with an expression of worry and confusion. Okay, she said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that only came from years of being the little sister who'd learned to demand explanations when the adults in her life were keeping secrets. Someone needs to tell me what's going on. My wedding reception is falling apart. My husband and my sister are having some kind of crisis, and his mother is telling everyone that Elena is having a breakdown. I want the truth, and I want it now. The four of us stood in a circle on the terrace, the string lights casting shadows across our faces as Cassandra waited for an explanation that none of us seemed prepared to give. Her wedding dress rustled in the evening breeze, and I could see mascara tracks on her cheeks despite her attempt to clean up her makeup before coming outside. Cassandra, Marcus began, but she held up her hand to stop him. No, let me talk first, she said, her voice carrying the kind of steel I remembered from our childhood when she'd had enough of being treated like she was too young to understand serious conversations. I've been watching this tension build all evening. Victoria keeps making snide comments about Elena, people are whispering about military this and PTSD that, and now my husband and my sister are out here having what looks like a therapy session with my aunt-in-law. She turned to look at me directly, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Elena, I know you've been through hell overseas, and I know coming back hasn't been easy, but you're my sister, and you're supposed to be here celebrating with me, not hiding on the terrace looking like someone died. The words stung, partly because they were true, and partly because they revealed how much distance had grown between Cassandra and me since I'd returned from my final deployment. She knew I'd been struggling, but she didn't understand the depth of it. The way that simple social interactions had become minefields, and the way that being around happy couples reminded me of everything I'd lost. And Marcus, she continued, turning to her new husband with an expression that was equal parts love and frustration. I've been married to you for exactly 4 hours, and I'm already learning that you've been keeping major secrets from me. What? Military service? What shared history? What the hell is going on? Dr. Chen stepped forward slightly, her professional instincts clearly kicking in as she recognized the potential for this conversation to spiral out of control. Cassandra, maybe we should sit down for this. There's quite a bit to unpack, and it's complicated. I don't want to sit down, Cassandra said firmly. I want answers. I want to know why my wedding reception feels like a war zone, and I want to know what my husband and my sister have been hiding from me. Marcus ran his hands through his hair again, completely destroying what was left of his formal styling. Cassandra, I served in Afghanistan. I never told you because I was ashamed of some of the things that happened during my deployment, and I didn't want those experiences to define how you saw me. Cassandra stared at him for a long moment, processing this information. You were in Afghanistan? At the same time as Elena? Not exactly the same time, Marcus said carefully. But our paths crossed in a way that's complicated. How complicated? Cassandra asked, her voice getting sharper with each question. I knew that Marcus was trying to find a way to explain our connection without going into the graphic details of combat and casualties. But Cassandra deserved the truth, even if it was difficult to hear. He was involved in an intelligence operation that went wrong, I said. Soldiers in my unit were killed or injured because of decisions his unit made. The words hung in the air like a physical presence, and I watched as Cassandra's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, shock, disbelief, and finally a kind of horrified understanding. You're telling me that my husband was responsible for getting soldiers killed, and one of those soldiers was someone you knew? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. It's not that simple, Marcus said quickly. Elena, please, let me explain it properly. But Cassandra was already shaking her head, backing away from both of us like we were dangerous. No, this is exactly that simple. You both knew about this connection, and neither of you thought to mention it before today, before I married him. I didn't know, I protested. I had no idea Marcus had served until someone mentioned it during dinner, and I certainly didn't know about his role in what happened to my unit. But you knew something was wrong, Cassandra said, her voice rising. You've been acting strange all evening, uncomfortable, like you didn't want to be here. And now I find out it's because my husband was involved in getting your friends killed. The accusation felt like a physical blow, and I realized that Cassandra was right. I had been acting strangely, but not for the reasons she thought. My discomfort had been about Victoria's hostility and the general atmosphere of disapproval, not about any hidden knowledge of Marcus's military service. Cassandra, that's not fair, Dr. Chen interjected gently. Elena couldn't have known about Marcus's service record, and she certainly couldn't have known about their shared history. Isn't it? Cassandra shot back. Because it seems like everyone in this family has been keeping secrets from me. Marcus hides his military service. Elena acts like being here is torture, and apparently you all think I'm too fragile to handle the truth about my own wedding. From inside the reception hall, we could hear the band transitioning to something slower, and I realized that the evening was continuing without us while we stood on the terrace having this increasingly heated conversation. Guests were probably starting to notice that the bride, groom, and several key family members had all disappeared, and I could only imagine what Victoria Chen was telling people about our absence. Nobody thinks you're fragile, Marcus said, reaching toward Cassandra, but she stepped back to avoid his touch. I was trying to protect you from having to deal with my baggage on what should be the happiest day of your life. By lying to me? Cassandra asked. By pretending to be someone you're not? By letting me find out at my own wedding reception that my husband and my sister have this horrible connection that neither of them thought to mention. I wasn't pretending to be someone else, Marcus said, his voice carrying a note of desperation. My military service is part of my past, but it's not who I am now. I'm the same person you fell in love with, the same person who wants to build a life with you. Cassandra laughed, but there was no humor in it. The same person? Marcus, you've Been lying to me for 2 years. Every time I asked about your time in college. Every time I wondered why you never talked about your early 20s. Every time I tried to understand why you sometimes wake up screaming. You've been lying to me. The mention of Marcus having nightmares surprised me, and I found myself looking at him with new understanding. He carried his own trauma from Afghanistan, his own guilt and sleepless nights, but he'd been handling it alone rather than seeking help or even acknowledging it to the woman he'd married. I wasn't lying, Marcus said. I was just not telling you everything. That's the same thing, Cassandra said flatly. And now I find out that not only were you keeping secrets from me, but those secrets directly affect my sister, who's been struggling with her own trauma from the same war. Dr. Chen stepped forward again, her professional demeanor shifting into something more authoritative. Cassandra, I understand you're upset, and you have every right to be. But I think we need to separate the issues here. Marcus's decision to keep his military service private is separate from the coincidence that led to tonight's revelation. Is it, though? Cassandra asked, turning to face her new aunt-in-law. Because it seems like everyone in this situation has been making decisions about what I can and can't handle, what I should and shouldn't know, what's appropriate for me to be told about my own life. The accusation wasn't entirely fair, but it wasn't entirely wrong either. All of us had been making assumptions about Cassandra's emotional capacity, her ability to handle difficult information, her right to know the full truth about the people she loved. We'd been protecting her, but in doing so, we'd also been patronizing her. You're right, I said, the admission coming out before I could second-guess myself. I should have told you I was struggling with being here tonight. I should have been honest about how hard it's been for me to adjust to civilian life, how difficult it is for me to be around large groups of people, how much I miss the friends I lost overseas. Marcus nodded, following my lead. And I should have told you about my service record from the beginning. I should have trusted you to handle the information and to love me despite the mistakes I made. Cassandra looked between us, her expression still angry, but also vulnerable in a way that reminded me of the little girl she'd been, the one who'd always wanted to be included in the grown-up conversations, even when they were about scary or difficult topics. I'm not made of glass, she said, her voice quieter now but still carrying an edge of hurt. I know the world is complicated and ugly sometimes. I know that people I love have been through terrible things. But I can't help you or support you or even understand you if you don't tell me what's really going on. The truth of her words settled over the terrace like a weight, and I realized that in trying to protect Cassandra from the harsh realities of military life and trauma, I'd been shutting her out of my healing process. I'd been treating her like a civilian who couldn't possibly understand, rather than like my sister who deserved the chance to try. There's something else, Marcus said, his voice barely audible above the sound of the river below us. Something I haven't told any of you, including Elena. All three women turned to look at him, and I could see in his expression that whatever he was about to reveal was going to change everything once again. The evening had already been full of unexpected revelations, but something about Marcus's demeanor suggested that we hadn't reached the bottom of the secrets yet. The intelligence operation that led to the convoy ambush, he said, his words coming out in a rush like he was afraid he'd lose his courage if he didn't say them quickly. It wasn't just about catching a compromised interpreter. It was about something much bigger, and Elena has a right to know what her unit was really being used for. Marcus's words created a silence so complete that I could hear the distant sound of traffic from the highway and the gentle lapping of the river against the dock below. The string lights above us seemed to dim, or maybe that was just my vision, narrowing as I prepared myself for whatever bomb he was about to drop. What do you mean, something bigger? I asked, my voice sounding hollow even to my own ears. Marcus glanced around the terrace, as if checking to make sure we were truly alone, then moved closer to our small circle. The convoy wasn't just bait to catch Khalil Nasiri. It was part of a larger operation to identify and eliminate an entire network of double agents that had been feeding information to insurgent groups for months. Dr. Chen leaned forward, her professional curiosity overriding her role as family mediator. Marcus, are you talking about classified information? Because if you are, maybe this isn't the appropriate venue. It's not classified anymore, Marcus interrupted. The operation was declassified 2 years ago as part of a congressional investigation into intelligence failures in Afghanistan. But the families of the soldiers who died were never told the full truth about what their loved ones were really doing that day. I felt my knees go weak, and I had to reach for the railing again to steady myself. You're saying that Sergeant Williams, Corporal Davis, and Specialist Morrison didn't die in a random convoy ambush. You're saying they died as part of a deliberate intelligence operation? Yes, Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. Your unit was specifically chosen because you had the best survival rates under fire. The planners believed that if anyone could survive a complex ambush and complete the mission, it would be the 82nd Airborne Medics. Cassandra, who had been silent throughout this exchange, suddenly spoke up. Mission? What mission? I thought Elena said it was a supply run. The supplies were real, Marcus continued, but they were secondary. The primary mission was to deliver a tracking device to the outpost that would allow us to monitor communications between the compromised interpreters and their insurgent contacts. The device had to be hand-delivered by someone the insurgents wouldn't suspect. A medic, I said, the pieces clicking together in my mind with horrible clarity. They used a medical supply convoy because no one would suspect a medic of carrying intelligence equipment. Marcus nodded miserably. The device was hidden in your medical supplies. You carried it for 20 kilometers through hostile territory without knowing it was there. The revelation hit me like a physical blow, and I found myself thinking back to that day with new understanding. The medical supplies had been heavier than usual, but I'd assumed it was because we were carrying extra morphine and antibiotics for the outpost. The convoy commander had insisted on a specific route that seemed unnecessarily dangerous, but I'd trusted his judgment about security conditions. How long have you known about this? I asked, my voice getting stronger as my anger began to build. I found out about the tracking device the day after the ambush, Marcus said. My commanding officer called me in for a debriefing and told me that the operation had been successful despite the casualties. The device had been delivered, and within a week, we'd identified and eliminated 12 insurgent cells based on the intelligence it provided. Cassandra stepped forward, her expression shifting from hurt to fury. You're telling me that Elena's friends died so that you could plant a bug in a building? It wasn't just a bug, Marcus said defensively. The intelligence we gathered saved hundreds of lives. We were able to prevent attacks on 3 different bases, intercept weapons shipments, and identify insurgent leaders who had been operating in the shadows for years. That doesn't make it right, Dr. Chen said quietly. Using soldiers as unwitting couriers without their knowledge or consent is a violation of military ethics, regardless of the outcome. I turned to stare at Marcus, seeing him clearly for the first time all evening. You've known for 5 years that my unit was used as unknowing participants in an intelligence operation. You've known that Tommy Morrison lost his leg not because of a random attack, but because your unit decided his sacrifice was acceptable collateral damage for a larger mission. Elena, it wasn't my decision, Marcus said desperately. I was a lieutenant. I followed orders. I didn't have the authority to question the operation or to warn your unit about what was really happening. But you had the authority to live with the knowledge, I shot back. You had the authority to build a new life, to fall in love, to get married, while the soldiers who carried out your mission dealt with the consequences. The sound of the terrace door opening interrupted our conversation, and we all turned to see Victoria Chen stepping outside, her expression a mixture of concern and barely contained fury. I'm sorry to interrupt, she said, though her tone suggested she wasn't sorry at all. But the reception is falling apart. The guests are asking questions. The photographer is packing up his equipment, and half the wedding party is looking for the bride and groom. Cassandra wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing what was left of her makeup. "Tell them we'll be right in." "Cassandra, dear," Victoria said, her voice taking on the patronizing tone I'd heard her use all evening. "Perhaps it would be better if some people called it an early night. This conversation seems to be getting quite heated, and we wouldn't want to upset the other guests." The suggestion was clearly directed at me, and I felt the familiar surge of anger that had been building all evening finally reach its breaking point. "Mrs. Chen, I appreciate your concern, but this is a family matter that doesn't require your input." Victoria's eyes narrowed, and her mask of polite concern dropped entirely. "Young lady, this is my son's wedding, and I will not have it ruined by your inability to control your emotions in public." "Victoria," Dr. Chen said sharply, "that's enough." But Victoria was clearly past the point of being reined in by family members. "No, Sarah, it's not enough. This woman has been disruptive all evening, making everyone uncomfortable with her intensity and her military obsession. Now she's dragging my son into some kind of trauma-induced confrontation that belongs in a therapist's office, not at a wedding reception." The words hit their mark, and I felt something inside me snap. "You're right, Mrs. Chen. This conversation does belong in a therapist's office. But since your son chose to reveal classified information about a military operation at his wedding reception, this is where we're having it." Victoria's face went pale at my words, and I could see her processing the implications of what I'd just said. The mention of classified information had clearly caught her off guard, and for the first time all evening, she seemed to be at a loss for her usual cutting remarks. "Classified information?" she repeated, her voice uncertain. "What are you talking about?" Before I could respond, the terrace door opened again, and this time it was David Chen who stepped outside, followed by two other men I recognized as Marcus's groomsmen. They looked concerned and slightly out of breath, as if they'd been searching the entire venue for the missing wedding party. "There you are," David said, relief evident in his voice. "Mom, we've been looking everywhere for you. The guests are starting to leave, and people are asking if something's wrong." Victoria turned to her younger son with visible frustration. "Everything is wrong, David. Your brother's new sister-in-law is having some kind of episode, and she's dragging Marcus into her military drama on his wedding night." "It's not drama," I said, my voice carrying the kind of authority I'd learned in the army when dealing with people who refused to listen to reason. "Your son was involved in a military intelligence operation that resulted in the deaths of soldiers in my unit. That's not drama, that's fact." David's expression shifted from confusion to alarm as he looked between Marcus and me. "Marcus, what is she talking about?" Marcus ran his hands over his face, looking exhausted by the weight of secrets he'd been carrying for years. "David, it's complicated. There are things about my military service that I never told the family." "What things?" David pressed. "You said you were in logistics, that you pushed papers around and coordinated supply deliveries." "That was part of it," Marcus said. "But I was also involved in intelligence operations that I couldn't talk about, even after I got out." One of the groomsmen, a tall man with dark hair who I remembered being introduced as Marcus's college roommate, stepped forward with obvious concern. "Dude, are you okay? You look like you're about to collapse." "I'm fine, Jake," Marcus said. But his voice carried none of the confidence the words were meant to convey. "I just need to finish this conversation with Elena, and then we can get back to the reception." But Victoria wasn't willing to let the situation continue. "No, Marcus. This ends now. I don't care what happened in Afghanistan or what secrets you think you need to share. This is your wedding day, and I will not let it be ruined by ancient history and military trauma." Dr. Chen stepped between her sister-in-law and the rest of us, her professional demeanor shifting into something more protective. "Victoria, you need to stop. This isn't about the wedding anymore. It's about Marcus and Elena processing shared trauma, and your interference is making it worse." "Shared trauma?" Victoria laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Sarah, You're enabling this situation. This woman needs professional help, not a family therapy session on our terrace." The dismissiveness in her voice, the way she kept referring to me as this woman, like I was some kind of unstable stranger rather than her daughter-in-law's sister, finally pushed me past my breaking point. "My name is Staff Sergeant Elena Rodriguez," I said, my voice carrying the kind of command presence that made everyone on the terrace stop talking and look at me. "I served 3 tours in Afghanistan with the 82nd Airborne Division. I have a Purple Heart, a Bronze Star, and a combat medical badge. I saved lives, including the life of a 19-year-old kid from Kansas who your son's intelligence operation nearly got killed." The silence that followed was complete, broken only by the distant sound of music from inside the reception hall. Victoria stared at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Part shock, part embarrassment, part something that might have been grudging respect. "I didn't come here tonight to cause problems," I continued. "I came here to celebrate my sister's wedding. But I won't be dismissed or patronized by someone who's never put on a uniform, never been shot at, never held a dying soldier in their arms while calling for a medevac that might not make it in time." David looked between his mother and me, clearly struggling to process this new information. "Elena, I had no idea. When I talked to you earlier, I didn't realize—" "You didn't realize because you made assumptions," I said, turning to face him. "You assumed that because I came alone, I was somehow defective. You assumed that because I was quiet, I was antisocial. You assumed that because I have PTSD, I'm unstable." "That's not what I meant," David protested, but his words lacked conviction. "It's exactly what you meant," I said. "And it's what your mother has been implying all evening, that I don't belong here, that I'm making people uncomfortable, that I should leave early to spare everyone the burden of dealing with a damaged veteran." Cassandra, who had been watching this exchange with growing distress, finally found her voice. "Elena, stop. Please. This isn't helping anyone." I turned to look at my sister, seeing the tears streaming down her face and the way her wedding dress seemed to hang on her frame like a costume she no longer wanted to wear. "You're right," I said, my anger deflating as quickly as it had built. "This isn't helping anyone, least of all you." "I just want to understand," Cassandra said, her voice breaking. "I want to understand why everyone I love has been keeping secrets from me, why my wedding has turned into a battlefield, why I feel like I don't really know any of you." Marcus reached toward her, but she stepped back, shaking her head. "No, don't. I need space to process all of this. I need to figure out how I feel about learning that my husband was involved in getting people killed, that my sister has been struggling with trauma she never told me about, that my new family thinks. I'm too fragile to handle the truth." Victoria opened her mouth to speak, but Dr. Chen held up a hand to stop her. "Victoria, I think you've said enough for one evening." "I was trying to protect the wedding," Victoria said defensively. "I was trying to maintain some dignity and celebration on what should have been a joyful occasion. By attacking a combat veteran who's dealing with PTSD?" Dr. Chen asked, her voice sharp with disapproval. "By dismissing her service and her sacrifice? By trying to force her to leave her own sister's wedding?" Victoria's face flushed with embarrassment, and for the first time all evening, she seemed to realize that her behavior had been inappropriate. I didn't understand the full situation." "No, you didn't," I agreed. "But you made judgments anyway. You decided I was the problem without bothering to learn who I really was or what I'd been through." The terrace fell silent again, and I could see everyone processing the events of the evening, trying to figure out how to move forward from this point. The wedding reception was still continuing inside, but out here on the terrace, it felt like we were in a completely different world. One where the careful social facades had been stripped away to reveal the raw truth underneath. The moment stretched between us like a taut wire, everyone waiting for someone else to make the first move toward resolution or complete breakdown. The music from inside had shifted to something softer, more romantic, and I could hear the murmur of guests who were probably wondering where the wedding party had disappeared to during what should have been the highlight of the evening. It was Marcus who finally broke the silence, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. "Elena, there's one more thing I need to tell you, about Tommy Morrison." I felt my stomach drop, wondering what other revelations this night could possibly hold. "What about Tommy?" "After the convoy attack, after you saved his life, I tried to have him transferred to a safer assignment. I pulled strings, called in favors, did everything I could to make sure he wouldn't be put in harm's way again." Marcus's words came out in a rush, like he'd been holding them back for years. But he refused the transfer. He said he wanted to finish his tour with his unit, that he wouldn't abandon his brothers. The information hit me unexpectedly, not because it was shocking, but because it was so perfectly Tommy. Even wounded, even facing months of recovery and the loss of his leg, he'd remained committed to his fellow soldiers. It was exactly the kind of stubborn loyalty that had made him such a good soldier in the first place. "He sent me a message through channels," Marcus continued. "He wanted me to know that he didn't blame me for what happened. He said that soldiers accept risks when they put on the uniform, and that the intelligence we gathered from that operation probably saved more lives than were lost." I closed my eyes, trying to process this new piece of the puzzle. Tommy Morrison, the kid from Kansas who'd lost his leg because of a compromised intelligence operation, had forgiven the officer who'd sent him into that ambush. It was a level of grace I wasn't sure I was capable of matching. Did he really say that? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Marcus nodded. "I have the message if you want to see it. I've carried it with me for 5 years, along with the after-action reports and the congressional testimony about the operation. I kept telling myself that someday I'd find a way to make contact with the soldiers who'd been affected, to try to explain, to apologize. And instead you found me at your wedding," I said, the irony not lost on me. "Instead, I found you at my wedding," Marcus agreed, "which is either the worst possible timing or exactly the right moment, depending on how you look at it." Cassandra, who had been listening to this exchange with growing comprehension, suddenly stepped forward. "Wait, Marcus, are you saying that you've been carrying guilt about this for our entire relationship? That you've been having nightmares and anxiety attacks because of something that happened in Afghanistan?" Marcus looked at his new wife with an expression of such vulnerability that it was almost painful to witness. "Yes. The nightmares, the insomnia, the way I sometimes wake up in a cold sweat. It's all connected to that day, to the decisions I made, and the soldiers who died because of them. And you never told me," Cassandra said, her voice flat with hurt. "You let me think you were just stressed about work, or that you had trouble sleeping because of caffeine." "I was afraid you'd see me differently," Marcus admitted. "I was afraid you'd realize that the man you fell in love with was responsible for getting people killed." Dr. Chen, who had been observing this exchange with professional interest, stepped forward. "Marcus, that's classic survivor's guilt combined with moral injury. It's treatable, but not if you keep trying to handle it alone." Victoria, who had been uncharacteristically quiet during this conversation, suddenly spoke up. "I don't understand any of this. Marcus, you never told us you were having problems. You seemed so successful, so put together." "Because that's what you expected," Marcus said, turning to face his mother with something approaching anger. "You wanted a successful son who'd put his military service behind him and moved on to bigger and better things. You didn't want to hear about trauma or guilt or the cost of the decisions I'd made overseas." David stepped closer to his brother, his expression troubled. "Marcus, man, I had no idea. When you came back from Afghanistan, you seemed fine. You went straight to college, got your degree, started your career. I thought you'd transitioned perfectly." "I thought I had too," Marcus said. "I thought if I just focused on building a new life, the old one would fade away. But trauma doesn't work that way. It finds ways to surface, especially when you're trying to build something meaningful with another person. I found myself looking at Marcus with new understanding, seeing not just the logistics officer who'd been involved in the operation that had cost my soldiers their lives, but also a fellow veteran who'd been struggling with his own demons in silence. The anger I'd been carrying all evening began to shift into something more complex, a mixture of empathy and shared recognition. "Marcus," I said, my voice gentler than it had been all evening, "you can't heal from something you won't acknowledge. And you can't build a healthy relationship with someone you're keeping secrets from." Cassandra nodded emphatically. "That's exactly right. How can I support you through something if I don't even know it exists? How can I understand your nightmares if you won't tell me what they're about?" "Because I was afraid of exactly this," Marcus said, gesturing to the chaos around us. "I was afraid that my past would contaminate the future I was trying to build with you." "But it already was contaminating it," Dr. Chen pointed out. "Your untreated trauma was affecting your relationship, whether Cassandra knew about it or not." The secrecy was just adding another layer of dysfunction. The truth of her words settled over the terrace like a weight, and I could see everyone processing the implications. The evening had started as a celebration of new beginnings, but it had become a reckoning with unresolved pasts and the ways that secrets could poison even the most well-intentioned relationships. From inside the reception hall, the music stopped abruptly, and we could hear someone making an announcement over the sound system. The words were muffled by distance and the closed doors, but the tone suggested that the formal part of the evening was winding down. "We should go back inside," Cassandra said, but she made no move toward the door. "People are probably wondering where we are." "Let them wonder," Victoria said, surprising everyone with the firmness in her voice. "This conversation is more important than keeping up appearances for the guests." Victoria's words hung in the air, and I realized that this was perhaps the first time all evening that she'd prioritized substance over appearances. The admission seemed to surprise her as much as it did the rest of us, and she looked around the terrace with something approaching bewilderment, as if she couldn't quite believe she'd just said that maintaining social facades was less important than dealing with real problems. "Mom," David said quietly, "are you okay?" Victoria smoothed down her dress, a gesture that seemed more about steadying herself than fixing her appearance. "No, David, I'm not okay. I've spent this entire evening trying to control a situation I didn't understand, making assumptions about people I didn't really know, and prioritizing what the guests might think over what my family was actually going through." She turned to look at me directly, her expression carrying none of the hostility that had characterized our interactions throughout the night. "Elena, I owe you an apology. I treated you terribly tonight, and I did it based on prejudices and fears I didn't even realize I was carrying." The apology caught me completely off guard. I'd been prepared for continued confrontation, for more attempts to get me to leave early or stay quiet, but not for this kind of honest acknowledgement of wrongdoing. "Mrs. Chen," I began, but she held up her hand. "Victoria," she corrected. "And please, let me finish. I grew up in a generation where military service was something men did, something that happened far away from the lives of ordinary families. I never learned how to interact with veterans, especially female veterans, and I let my ignorance turn into judgment." Dr. Chen looked at her sister-in-law with obvious surprise. "Victoria, I've never heard you admit to being wrong about anything." "Well, there's a first time for everything," Victoria said with a weak smile. "And tonight seems to be full of firsts. First time learning my son served in combat. First time realizing I've been dismissing trauma as weakness. First time understanding that my need to control social situations was actually making them worse." Cassandra stepped forward, still in her wedding dress but looking more like herself than she had all evening. "Victoria, I appreciate the apology, but the bigger issue is that we're all standing here realizing we don't really know each other as well as we thought we did." She looked around the circle of faces, her gaze lingering on Marcus and then on me. My husband kept his military service secret for 2 years. My sister has been struggling with PTSD, and I didn't even realize how bad it was. My new mother-in-law has been operating from prejudices she didn't even know she had. And I've been so focused on having the perfect wedding that I missed all the signs that the people I love were carrying heavy burdens. Marcus reached for Cassandra's hand, and this time she didn't pull away. Cassandra, I'm sorry. I'm sorry I kept secrets. I'm sorry I didn't trust you with the truth. And I'm sorry our wedding day became about dealing with my unresolved trauma instead of celebrating our future together. I'm sorry too, I added. I should have been more honest with you about how difficult it's been for me to readjust to civilian life. I should have told you I was struggling instead of just trying to power through it and hoping no one would notice. Dr. Chen, who had been quietly observing this exchange of apologies and acknowledgments, stepped forward. This is actually exactly the kind of conversation families need to have, even if the timing is unconventional. Secrets and assumptions create distance between people who love each other, and the only way to bridge that distance is through honest communication. Even if that communication happens during a wedding reception? David asked with a slight smile. Especially if it happens during a wedding reception, Dr. Chen replied. Sometimes crisis creates the opportunity for breakthrough, and sometimes the most important conversations happen when we least expect them. The terrace door opened again, and this time it was Emma, the maid of honor, who appeared. She looked worried and slightly frazzled, her carefully styled hair showing signs of the stress of trying to manage a reception where key participants kept disappearing. Cassandra, people are starting to ask if everything's okay, she said. The band is wondering if you want them to keep playing, and some of the older guests are talking about heading home. Cassandra looked around our circle, her expression thoughtful. Emma, would you mind making an announcement? Tell everyone that the bride and groom are taking a few minutes to have an important family conversation, and that we'll be back inside shortly to properly thank everyone for coming. Emma nodded, though she looked curious about what kind of family conversation would take priority over wedding reception duties. After she disappeared back inside, Cassandra turned to face all of us. I have a proposal, she said, her voice carrying the kind of determination I remembered from our childhood when she'd made up her mind about something. Instead of going back in there and pretending everything is fine, instead of putting on happy faces and dancing to songs while we're all processing major revelations about each other, why don't we use this moment to start over? Start over how? Marcus asked. By being honest, Cassandra said simply. By admitting that this evening has been difficult but important. By acknowledging that we have work to do as a family. And by committing to doing that work together instead of keeping secrets and making assumptions. Victoria nodded slowly. I think that's the most mature response to this situation I've heard all evening. It's also the most hopeful, I added, feeling something shift in my chest that might have been the beginning of relief. Because it means we can learn from tonight instead of just surviving it. The decision to return to the reception felt different. Now, not like we were putting on masks to hide what had happened, but like we were choosing to face our guests and our future with a new kind of honesty. As we walked back through the terrace doors, I could feel the shift in our group dynamic. The secrets were out, the assumptions had been challenged, and while we hadn't solved everything, we'd at least stopped pretending that problems didn't exist. The reception hall buzzed with the kind of subdued energy that comes when guests sense something significant has happened but don't know what. Conversations paused as we entered, and I could see people trying to read our faces for clues about what had kept the wedding party outside for so long. Emma approached us immediately, her expression a mixture of relief and curiosity. Should I have the band start up again? She asked Cassandra. Actually, Cassandra said, her voice carrying across the room with surprising authority. I'd like to say something to everyone first. The band leader, picking up on the cue, turned off the music and handed Cassandra a microphone. The reception hall fell silent as she stepped into the center of the dance floor, still in her wedding dress, but somehow looking more regal and composed than she had all evening. I want to thank everyone for being here tonight to celebrate Marcus and me, she began, her voice steady despite everything we'd been through. "This evening hasn't gone exactly as planned, but it's been more meaningful than I could have imagined." She paused, looking around the room at the faces of family and friends who'd come to witness her marriage. "Sometimes the most important conversations happen when we least expect them. Tonight, my family and I had one of those conversations. And while it was difficult, it reminded us why we love each other and why honesty is the foundation of any strong relationship." I watched from the edge of the dance floor as Cassandra continued, speaking, her words carrying a wisdom that seemed to have emerged from the chaos of the evening. She didn't go into details about what had happened on the terrace, but she acknowledged that families are complicated, that people carry burdens they don't always share, and that love sometimes means having hard conversations at inconvenient times. "My sister Elena is a combat veteran who served 3 tours in Afghanistan," Cassandra said, and I felt my breath catch as she gestured in my direction. "She's a Purple Heart recipient who saved lives under fire and sacrificed more for this country than most of us can imagine. I'm proud to be her sister, and I'm proud that she's here with us tonight." The applause that followed was spontaneous and sustained, and I found myself standing straighter as I looked around the room at faces that no longer held curiosity or judgment, but respect. Victoria Chen was clapping enthusiastically, tears streaming down her face, and even David looked moved by his new sister-in-law's words. Marcus stepped forward and took the microphone from Cassandra. "I also served in Afghanistan," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the sound system. "It's something I haven't talked about much, but tonight reminded me that our experiences, even the difficult ones, are part of who we are. They don't define us, but they do shape us, and the people we love deserve to know our whole story." He looked directly at me as he continued speaking. "Elena and I discovered tonight that our paths crossed overseas in ways we never knew. While our shared history is complicated, I have nothing but respect for her service and her sacrifice. She represents the best of what it means to be a soldier: courage, dedication, and an unshakable commitment to protecting others." The room erupted in applause again, and I felt something in my chest that I hadn't experienced in months, a sense of belonging, of being seen and valued for who I really was, rather than having to hide parts of myself to make others comfortable, as Z. The applause died down. Marcus handed the microphone back to Cassandra. "There's one more thing I want to say," she added, her voice warm with emotion. "Tonight reminded me that the best families aren't the ones without problems. They're the ones who face their problems together with love and honesty." She looked around the room one more time, her gaze lingering on Victoria, on me, on Marcus, on all the people who'd been part of the evening's revelations. "So, thank you for being here, not just for the celebration, but for the real stuff too. Thank you for being the kind of people who understand that love isn't always pretty or convenient, but it's always worth fighting for." The band started playing again, something soft and hopeful, and couples began moving onto the dance floor. But instead of the formal, careful dancing that had characterized the earlier part of the evening, this felt more natural, more relaxed, as if everyone had permission to be themselves rather than their best-behaved versions. Marcus extended his hand to Cassandra, and they moved together in the center of the floor. But now their dance looked different. Less performance, more connection. Victoria approached me hesitantly, her expression uncertain but hopeful. "Elena," she said, "I know I have a lot to make up for, but I was wondering if you'd be willing to dance with an old woman who's still learning how to do better." I looked at this woman who'd spent most of the evening trying to get rid of me, who'd made assumptions about my stability and my place in the family, who'd just publicly acknowledged her mistakes and asked for a chance to start over. "I'd be honored," I said, and I meant it. As we moved onto the dance floor together, I caught sight of my reflection in the mirrored wall behind the band. For the first time all evening, I looked like myself. Not the uncomfortable outsider trying to fit in. Not the damaged veteran hiding her struggles. but Staff Sergeant Elena Rodriguez, sister, survivor, and finally, family. The evening had started with secrets and ended with truth, had begun with isolation and concluded with connection. It wasn't the wedding reception any of us had planned, but it was exactly the one we'd needed. 6 months later, I stood in the same cathedral where Cassandra and Marcus had been married, but this time I wasn't alone. Tommy Morrison sat in the front pew, his prosthetic leg barely noticeable beneath his dress uniform. Next to him sat 3 other soldiers from our old unit, and behind them, Victoria Chen dabbed at her eyes with a tissue as she watched me receive the Community Service Award from the Veterans Affairs Office. The nonprofit I'd started, Morrison's Bridge, had connected over 200 veterans with family counseling services, helping bridge the gap between military and civilian life that had nearly destroyed so many relationships. Marcus served on our board of directors, using his intelligence background to help us navigate government bureaucracy, while Cassandra handled our fundraising events with the same determination she'd shown that night on the terrace. "The thing about being buried," I said into the microphone, looking out at the audience of veterans, family members, and supporters, "is that sometimes you discover you weren't buried at all. Sometimes you were planted." The ceremony ended with the same spontaneous applause that had surprised me at the wedding reception. But this time I wasn't surprised by the love I saw in the faces around me. Victoria Chen had become one of our most vocal advocates, using her social connections to raise awareness about veteran issues. David had started a legal clinic providing free services to veterans dealing with disability claims. That evening, as I drove home past the cherry tree I'd planted in Hope Grove, now surrounded by dozens of others planted by families who'd found healing through our program, I thought about how the worst night of my civilian life had become the foundation for the best work I'd ever done. Sometimes the people who try to bury you don't realize they're planting seeds that will grow into something beautiful and strong. If this story inspired you, subscribe to our channel, because everyone deserves to know that their darkest moments can become their greatest victories.